difference. A difference because it's probably the first time that I see a large number of potential entrepreneurs here, most of whom, at least I must confess, I am not familiar with. Otherwise, at all these formal launches, we always have the usual suspects. And that itself is indicative of the break that Startup India is going to make with what conventional economy and the formal launches of programs in the conventional economy itself are. I think another very significant difference of what makes it a landmark event is a final break or the ultimate break that you have with the conventional license Raj of India. We ostensibly broke away from it in 1991. I am certainly not a great favorite with those who supported the idea of that license Raj even at that moment, because that was conceived with an idea that the government would decide as to what businesses can be carried on and by whom they could be carried on. The government would also decide the geographical locations and the volumes of those businesses. And the entire intention or the eventual consequence of that was to restrict the energies of the people, to constrain them, and find virtues in that constrained economy itself. We did well to break off from it in 1991. But the break was only partial. It was partial because who would be funded? There was an invisible role of the state. Control over land, land permissions, foreign investment proposals, environmental clearances, and of course, unless the political nods came to venture into newer areas which involved a lot of capital, a lot of energy going into it, an entrepreneur or an investor were normally reluctant. Our effort over the last few years has been to restrict the role of the state essentially as a facilitator or in policy domain. When Prime Minister Modi was voted to power in 2014, if I look back at the changes and the direction of the changes in which we moved in, I think some of them are extremely significant. I find that the traffic of industry visiting North Block has almost ended. There are no piles of FIPB clearances which are pending. There are no files to be pushed. Amitabh is being called repeatedly an evangelist because the DIPP was the corridor in which most people visited in order to have their proposals supported by the government. Its role is now one of a campaigner. Its role is now one of an enabler. And I think these are extremely important changes which have taken place. What is then going to be the key difference once the startup movement picks up? And if I put it in a very simple sentence, is going to be the eventual freedom from the state that Indian entrepreneurship will now enjoy. It will only be a limited support of the state in terms of its programs so that there is an easier availability of capital, there is a friendly tax regime which is available, and there is an unleashing of the energies of an Indian entrepreneur where he can use technology, he can use his sense of innovation, he can use his enterprise, and then for him sky is the real limit. And I think there is no other option or alternative that an overpopulated country like India has at the moment today. If we look at the direction in which the conventional global economy is moving today, we are almost moving from a crisis situation literally by the day. Nobody really can envisage looking down the tunnel, as to what the situation of the world economy 1 year or 2 years from now is going to be. Nobody can seriously predict as to what the emerging challenges down the next few months are going to be. Earlier, the challenging situations used to come, a crisis-like situation used to come almost once in a decade. Today, it may emerge even twice in a day. You may have the impact of Chinese economy and their currency on one part of the world. You may have the oil prices striking you at the other part of the world, and you'll have a global impact simultaneously of these challenges. Unquestionably, the world economy has slowed down. Now, we can take a limited satisfaction, and I consciously use the word limited satisfaction, that even in a crisis-like situation in the world, we are growing much faster. The world almost universally recognizes us as probably the fastest growing amongst the major economies. But then we are not without our own challenges. We are fully conscious of the adverse situation in which we are struggling to keep respectable growth rates in the Indian economy. We have certain advantages. We have a booming services sector. We have a manufacturing sector slowly growing. We have increased our public spending. We've opened our doors wide enough, and foreign investment is coming in a big way. At least in the urban areas, we can see an increasing demand. And therefore, these are the engines which are keeping this growth rate alive. But at the same time, we also have challenges of, and realistically, if we recognize those challenges, a lot of our agricultural production, which is rain-fed, private investment is slow. We've had 2 weak seasons of monsoon. And as my colleagues just mentioned, the governments now have limited potential to create jobs within the governmental system. The private sector's own expansion itself is throwing up a challenge because they've overstressed themselves, and their stress in turn gets reflected on our banking system, something which the Reserve Bank and the government acting in tandem are now over the next few months going to add to the bankers' ability to improve and be able to lend in with greater amounts. Now, it's under these circumstances that the government really had to explore new areas. And it is amongst those newer areas that we conceived of the Mudra scheme. Now, the Mudra scheme that the government conceived of is actually intended to target 25% of the bottom part of India's population. So people get loans from refinance agencies, public sector banks, private sector banks and other agencies. Earlier they were being exploited by money lenders at very high rates, now they get at the banking rate. And I must say that the program has been reasonably successful in the last 4 to 5 months. Almost 1.73 crore entrepreneurs have enabled of those loans. By the end of this financial year, the figure would be significantly higher. And seeing the success of the movement, we are going to roll over that program year after year. And smaller entrepreneurs are being created by that process. On the Independence Day, the Prime Minister had announced the Stand Up India scheme. The Stand Up India would be separately launched, but it's a program which envisages that women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs belonging to the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes. Now, these were segments which are not throwing up entrepreneurs. Each bank branch, public sector or private sector, would actually adopt one in the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe category and one in the women's category. So they'd adopt 2 such entrepreneurs and fund them to set up establishments. It could be a trading establishment, it could be a manufacturing establishment. And by this process, at least you could target amongst these segments which have not been throwing up entrepreneurs, almost 300,000 new entrepreneurs over the next 1 or 2 years to be created. And then the Prime Minister's own idea, and this I must confess was his original idea, that this is the world where startups need to be encouraged. Last year in the budget, I had even suggested a startup fund for helping the creation of the startups. Needless to say, both the banking system and the government would make the resources available. We've already worked upon an entrepreneur-friendly taxation regime. There are some steps which can be taken by notifications, which would be taken forthwith. Others require a legislative provision which can only come as a part of the finance bill when the next budget is presented, in order to create a friendly taxation regime for startups. And we expect the new India, taking a cue from those Indians who elsewhere in the world, particularly in the Silicon Valley, which has sent a very large delegation here, utilize their sense of entrepreneurship, their sense of innovation, generated ideas and created wealth. And in turn, that wealth now is being used to supplement and support future startups across the country and elsewhere in the world. As I said in the beginning, that this would be literally the final break with the license Raj, because the regime intended to be created is to give a complete freedom from the state. The more this sector becomes unregulated, I think the better it will be in the interest of the segment. One of the reasons over the last 2 decades why India became an important IT center was because we had no laws governing the field. And I think this entire campaign is intended to create a supportive system, and that's the role of the state. And the rest really is your own sense of entrepreneurship. We are deeply encouraged by the extent of response that we visited, which we witnessed over the last few days. In hindsight, I think it would have been even understandable if this, notwithstanding the cold winter today, this function had been held in a stadium, because that's the number of people who wanted to attend this function and identified with this the Startup India launch itself, because this is an area where people want a complete ecosystem which is friendly to innovation, which is friendly to enterprise, where the best ideas in the world would be created, and those ideas leading to innovation would perhaps provide this country the best that is yet to be seen. Let me, towards the end, congratulate the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, my colleague Mrs. Sitaraman and Mr. Amitabh Kant and all their colleagues for having taken this great initiative. And let me express a hope that somewhere in this auditorium and elsewhere where people, potential entrepreneurs, are listening to us, probably there are some world beaters somewhere in this crowd. And I'm sure over the next few years we'll create that environment where you'll all become very powerful names to reckon with. We'll all be very proud of you. Thank you very much.